What's good? It's Woog. We've got the rematch between Chris Eubank Jr., 35 wins and 3 losses, versus Conor Benn, 23 wins and that 1 loss, versus Chris Eubank Jr. You know, at the conclusion of their first fight, which, I mean, let's just be honest, it was one of the better fights of the year. Yes, Chris Eubank Jr. definitely won by like a couple of rounds, but because of how Conor Benn performed throughout the fight and how much heart he showed and how much of a war it became and how it lived up to the hype after, you know, it being called off for multiple years due to Conor Benn's positive PED testing, all of the concerns over, you know, Chris Eubank Jr.'s rehydration clause and him having to come down to 160, the weight gap between Eubank and Benn, you know, their dad's history versus each other, and just this being a mega event. Even if Chris Eubank Jr. is one of the most talented fighters never to be a champion, and Conor Benn was a prospect / contender at 147 before they started to make Eubank Jr. versus Benn a thing, because of how the fight itself delivered, and you could even argue exceeded the hype with what we saw in the ring, there would be many reasons to make this rematch. But I privately wanted for Chris Eubank Jr. to maybe get another big payday or two and then call it a career. And I really wanted Conor Benn to get back to 147 or 154 if he can't do 147 anymore. But I wanted him to get back into his divisional mix and show us that he could deliver on a lot of the promise that he was showing as an up-and-comer before he tested positive for PED, knocking out Chris Algieri, knocking Chris Van Heerden out like in the second round, destroying Samuel Vargas. Conor Benn was one of those guys who was exciting to watch at 147. This is when Stanionis, you know, top 5 to 6 guy in the division. And this is when it was still crowded at the top with Errol Spence Jr. and Terrence Crawford. Then you had Boots Ennis, Virgil Ortiz. You still had Danny Garcia, Sean Porter, Ugas. It was really popping at 147. And I was just wondering how Eddie Hearn was going to navigate Conor Benn's career as he was fighting increasingly better opponents. I wanted him to get back to that again, whether it would be at 147 or now maybe at 154. But for all the reasons I mentioned, they're going right back into a rematch. So I don't know if we will ever really get back to Conor Benn just getting into the divisional mix. I mean, once you make this type of money that he's making in these 2 fights versus Eubank, what's the incentive to get back into the divisional mix and to do the heavy lifting within your division for probably a fraction of what you just made against Eubank Jr., unless Turki Al-Sheikh, you know, blesses him with the big bag. I could see Conor Benn never really getting back to that trajectory that he was on before all this. But, you know, here we are with the rematch, and, you know, the odds are actually pretty damn close here. Chris Eubank Jr. is roughly like a minus 150, like a 1.5 to 1 favorite. And Conor Benn, you might see him at like a plus 130. So they are really giving Conor Benn a good shot at winning this one. And there's a lot of reason to believe that he will win this rematch. I mean, Chris Eubank Jr. is a little bit older. He's now 36 years old. We've seen now that Conor Benn can really hurt Chris Eubank Jr. like he did in the 3rd round of their first fight, which was a big question. We knew that pre-PED, Conor Benn was hitting really hard, knocking out pretty good fighters, but after he tested positive and then he came back to 154 and fought, you know, kind of pedestrian level fights and had, you know, lackluster performances against Rodolfo Orozco and Peter Dobson, didn't stop either. So, you know, a lot of people were wondering, was it the PEDs that was the reason he was like punching so damn hard, or is he now punching less effectively now that he's at 154? So what's that going to mean when he's fighting Eubank Jr., a good fighter at 160? Will that punch carry? Well, now we know, yes, Conor Benn's power is real and he's got outsized punching power. There's certain fighters that punch so damn hard it carries up a weight class or 2. I think that Conor Benn is one of those punchers. So we know that he can hurt Chris Eubank Jr. And it did seem like the first fight between these two, Chris Eubank Jr. seemed like he was suffering from the weight cut and having to make 160 and then there being a rehydration clause. Like, this is a guy who's competed at 168 versus George Groves and James DeGale. And yes, he's fought more of his career at 160, and he's fought his last several fights at 160. But now at 36 years old, to still have to come all the way down to 160, I don't like that for Chris Eubank. And this first fight took place in April. We're in November. So this is a pretty quick turnaround to have to go right back down to 160 within like a half a year of their first fight. And even if you look at Eubank Jr.'s face after the first fight, he was really lumped up. You know, he went to the hospital, he was dehydrated, all kinds of things. Who's to say that the weight cut is going to be easier this second time around? I mean, he knows what he's in for, so maybe he was able to get ahead of it a bit more. Maybe he's having an easier time with it. I don't know, but that is obviously a big question mark here. And although he did objectively win the fight, he won majority of the rounds, it was a really tough fight for him that time. So there was, I think, a lot of damage that he took in that fight where, I mean, I don't know if his, punch absorption is going to be as tough, after he got hit in the third round. He took several punches throughout the rest of that fight. I mean, it became a bit of a dogfight. And yes, he was rocking Conor Benn too, obviously. But I don't know if Chris Eubank Jr. is not going to get lit up in this rematch like he did against Liam Smith. So there's a lot of reason to think that Conor Benn's going to win this one. And, the odds really reflect that. And I just think that the likelihood of the fight kind of playing out similarly to how it did in the first fight, I don't think that's going to be the case. And we often get, different fights where it could be a very competitive, nearly even fight, both guys taking damage throughout the entire fight. And then the rematch, boom, one guy knocks the other guy out like in a round or two. I mean, we recently got that with Fabio Wardley against Frazier Clark. First fight was like a fight of the year contender. And then in the rematch, Wardley just blasted Frazier Clark, I think like in the first round, and knocked him out. I wouldn't be surprised if this fight doesn't go past like 6-7 rounds. The question is, who's going to be the one eating those fight ending shots? Again, there's a lot of reason to believe that it's going to be Chris Eubank Jr. Like I said, Conor Benn's power has been established now. But so has Chris Eubank Jr.'s. And I mean, he's always been a hard puncher and he's always been a pretty athletic boxer. I think that he changed his style up over the past few years compared to his more brutish style when he was beating like James DeGale and getting outclassed by, George Groves and Billy Joe Saunders for his 2 losses before the Liam Smith loss. So he's lost to Billy Joe Saunders, George Groves, and then that stoppage loss, the only stoppage loss of his career against Liam Smith. I think, Eubank Jr., obviously when he was under the tutelage of Roy Jones Jr., changed his style up. And I think that he's been retooling and kind of refining that style to where it's not so hands down and reliant on your upper body movement. I think that he's been getting a little bit more aggressive in his most recent fights, like the rematch against Liam Smith. And then, well, the Conor Benn fight is a very unique thing unto itself. But I think that this fight, this rematch, is going to result in a stoppage. And when I envision the fight in my head, what I'm seeing is Conor Benn stopping Chris Eubank Jr. Like, when Chris Eubank Jr. was having the most trouble with Conor Benn, it was when Conor Benn was still pretty fresh. He was like slipping a lot. He was staying low in a crouch, and it looked like Chris Eubank Jr. couldn't really find him with the jab and couldn't maintain the distance, maintain the range, and he wasn't able to corral and control Conor Benn's entries. So if you're on the outside moving your head and Eubank Jr. is having trouble finding you with that lead hand, and you're able to launch your right hand and then your left hook on top of that and find Eubank with that, because Conor Benn was seemingly the quicker fighter in the first few rounds of that fight, yeah, things could get pretty bad and pretty ugly for Chris Eubank Jr. if you can't control this smaller, heavy-handed guy from the outside. And again, you can't control his entry points and you're not reading him and finding him like you need to. But in the second half of the fight, Chris Eubank Jr.'s jab kind of took over, and even when he would fight in the trenches, he started getting the better of those exchanges. I think Conor Benn started to get a little bit tired. Chris Eubank Jr. was also tying him up and walking him around and was showing that he was the bigger, stronger guy. So over time, it started to look like Chris Eubank Jr. was sort of not pulling away necessarily, but was winning these competitive rounds. And by the end of the 12th round, Chris Eubank Jr. really had Conor Benn in a lot of trouble. Not that Conor Benn was like wobbly legged or anything like that, but you saw the shots that he was taking. You saw Conor Benn start to spend more time against the ropes, just eating a lot of big shots, and you were just wondering, is Eubank Jr. going to stop Conor Benn? So although I can see Conor Benn from the outside just splashing a few meaningful shots to actually drop and maybe stop Chris Eubank Jr., I still think that the higher likelihood is that Chris Eubank Jr. finds Conor Benn with one of those check hooks or even an uppercut. And also, Conor Benn was having success with the jab like in the second and third round. I thought Conor Benn won the second round and then obviously hurt him and won the third round. Chris Eubank Jr. I thought won the first round. So Conor Benn was actually able to blast Eubank Jr. with a few nice jabs. But after, I would say, the fourth, fifth round, the jab wasn't working so well for Conor Benn, whereas Chris Eubank Jr.'s jab, again, started to kind of take over. So now Chris Eubank Jr. seen and felt Conor Benn's power. He knows what he's in for, and he knows that this guy really, really wants to take him out. Conor Benn is talking about the first fight like he was mistakenly going head over skis and going and doing too much hunting and was too relentless in his pursuit of Chris Eubank Jr. I kind of think that that's his best chance at winning, is catching Eubank Jr. in the first half of the fight and hurting him rather than boxing and fighting at a more measured pace. I don't think that would work well for Conor Benn unless, I mean, he can potentially conserve energy, spend some time on the outside and look to set up those big shots a little bit more patiently, perhaps. But in the meantime, I think that Chris Eubank Jr. is going to be picking him off with shots at range. Like you're either in range to throw your own punches if you're Conor Benn, or you've got to get way out of range, right? So I just have trouble seeing Conor Benn spending a ton of time way out of range, unless the strategy is to actually kind of get on your back foot and make Chris Eubank Jr. start to march forward on you, where you could then set the trap and try to catch Chris Eubank Jr. starting to come forward, get aggressive, and then Conor Benn can launch his right hand at unexpected times where you're changing levels, you're moving your head, and you're setting up the big shot with jabs, some head movement, and some feints. Maybe Conor Benn's able to skillfully employ that strategy. I don't think that he's going to be able to resist getting a little bit aggressive, especially if he's not having a lot of success at a more measured pace at range and Chris Eubank Jr. starts to visibly win some of those rounds. So I like an aggressive Conor Benn versus Eubank Jr. I don't think, as good as Conor Benn is, I don't think he outboxes Eubank Jr. And I don't think he's looking to outbox him. I think that he would use the boxing and use the patience to set up the big shots. So it is possible. And I, again, can very much see Conor Benn hurting or even dropping, maybe stopping Chris Eubank Jr. I'm not ruling that out at all. I would be a fool to. We saw what happened in the first fight. And again, for all those reasons that I mentioned, Chris Eubank Jr. might be very vulnerable in this rematch. But I actually think that Chris Eubank Jr. is going to catch Conor Benn with some nasty hooks. And I think that he's going to have a little more mojo earlier in the fight. He's got to be careful because that's when Conor Benn's probably going to be at his most dangerous, is in the first few rounds. But I think that Eubank Jr. is going to try to make a statement here. And I think that he almost looks at that first fight as being a fight that he won. But Conor Benn got the props really on that one. Yes, Eubank Jr. showed he had a ton of dog in him and he was in the trenches and he was just letting his hands go to the body and up top. But because he was pushed as much as he was and he looked as beaten up as he was and he got wobbly in the third round like he did and he just got tagged with some big meaningful shots, I think Chris Eubank Jr. is really going to try to take Conor Benn out. And sometimes if you try to do that, you yourself could get nailed, and that's, again, a possibility. And if Conor Benn was wise enough to set that up, that could work. But I'm actually going to go with Chris Eubank Jr. winning a short firefight here. I think that Chris Eubank Jr., who, sometimes he'll knock you down early and a couple of times maybe like he did against Liam Williams, but the opponents still go the distance. That happens in certain Chris Eubank Jr. fights where he's winning, but then he starts coasting a little bit. I don't think that he could afford to coast against somebody as hungry and tenacious as Conor Benn. I think Chris Eubank Jr. is going to have enough firepower to get Conor Benn out of there this time. I think that Conor Benn gave a lot in that first fight, and he really performed his butt off. He was very competitive. He did better than I thought he was going to do in that fight. But I think that Chris Eubank Jr.'s power is going to have more of a visible impact on Conor Benn in this rematch. We talk about the damage that Chris Eubank Jr. sustained in that first fight, What about the damage that Conor Benn sustained, like when he was up against the ropes and he was getting worn out and beaten on over the course of 12 rounds by the bigger guy, the bigger, stronger guy? I think that Chris Eubank Jr. is going to take him out here. I think it's going to be a very exciting fight. I don't think it's going to be as constantly exciting as the first fight was. That first fight was its own thing, I believe. It was special. But we might get more lulls in activity as Conor Benn tries to employ a slightly different strategy. But when he starts putting his foot on the gas, yes, he's going to be more dangerous, but yes, he's also going to be more susceptible. And I think Chris Eubank Jr. is going to take advantage of that more forcefully in this rematch. I think he stops Conor Benn in rounds like, I would say 5 through 7. I'm talking middle rounds, maybe 8, something like that. But I don't think it's going to go into the championship rounds. Not that it can. I mean, I think that any one of these outcomes is possible, including Conor Benn via decision. Like if he hurts and drops Eubank Jr. but can't get him out of there, and Chris Eubank Jr. is like fighting a very cautious fight where he's a little bit spent, but he's doing enough tying up, enough boxing, winning a few rounds, but he might get dropped again in the later rounds, but he's holding on to get out of the fight, but he makes it through the fight. Conor Benn could win a decision here as well. And Chris Eubank Jr. obviously, I believe, can win decision or via stoppage. So I think that any one of those results is possible. But I'm going to take Eubank Jr. to win it via stoppage. I think he's going to like drop him. He's going to give him the shaky leg, you know, probably with a check hook or something. And I think he stops Conor Benn rounds 5 through 7. But let me know what you think about this rematch. Were you hoping that Conor Benn got back on the horse in his respective division and started doing some of that heavy lifting and we could see him in some more appropriate matchups? I was really hoping for that, and I was thinking Chris Eubank Jr. could get, again, another lucrative fight or two and then call it a night, where he would retire being one of the more talented guys of his era to never win a major title, which has been frustrating and disappointing. I thought that there were different opportunities, especially at 160 after he lost to George Groves, where he beat James DeGale, kind of retired him at 168, came back to 160. I thought he was going to do more work at 160 against meaningful opponents. I know like Matt Korobov got injured in that fight, but I just thought that there was some opportunity there, some unfinished business, maybe fight Jamal Charlo, something like that. But yeah, a very interesting career for Chris Eubank Jr. And he's, again, on the back 9 of his, whereas Conor Benn is in a very different stage of his career. I just wonder, with these huge paydays, how much of an appetite to get into the mix. Like, I think Conor Benn beats like a Mario Barrios, but how are they going to schedule him depending on what happens in this rematch? Let me know your thoughts on all that in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.